Instead of filling your tackle box with a ton of expensive fishing lures that you'll never use, try these 5 bank fishing lures that always seem to work for me. My name's Wes Littlefield, and growing up pond fishing and now teaching my daughter how to fish has allowed me to hone in on 5 lures that work way better than the rest of the lures in my tackle box. And the first one is a spinnerbait. I love spinnerbait fishing because number 1, you're casting out and retrieving a lot. Number 2, it's just a tried and true lure. It's been around for years and it's caught fish for years, and it's still very, very effective. The reason that it's so good from the bank is because you can fish it in a variety of areas. I fished it along grass lines, I fished it rocky areas, through brush piles, I mean, you name it. On top of being very versatile, spinnerbaits also catch a wide variety of fish. I've caught crappie, I've caught bass, I've caught bluegill, I've even caught catfish using spinnerbaits. So no matter what species you're targeting, a spinnerbait will likely get them to bite. I like to fish a spinnerbait when there's a little bit of wind, meaning there's some ripple on the water, and not just when it's dead calm, because when it's dead calm, the fish just seem to not key in on it nearly as well. But when it is dead calm, I'll switch to a Texas rig. A Texas rig is way more subtle than a spinnerbait, and sometimes that's just what the fish want more. One of my favorite plastics to use is a lizard. I'm always surprised at how few people actually throw this soft plastic, or maybe the pros are just trying to hide it and not tell everybody about it because they talk more about using a worm, and worms are great, but I tend to have more success using a lizard. And that's because when you Texas rig it, you can fish it pretty much anywhere. It's even more snag proof than a spinnerbait because the hook is covered if you rig it correctly. Once again, I've fished Texas rig lizards through grass, around brush piles, along rocks, and I fish it in the open, along the bottom, or keeping it higher in the water column above the fish. Wherever the fish are at, a Texas rig can likely reach them. Now, I've used a Texas rig and a spinnerbait for years, but this next lure is still relatively new to my tackle box. Now, I've been using it for probably 3 or 4 years, but compared to many of the other lures, I just haven't been using it as long, and that's the bladed jig. When I first started using the bladed jig, I was amazed and asked myself why the heck I hadn't started using it earlier. This is because I caught a ton of more fish. Even though it's similar to a spinnerbait, I would find days when they wouldn't hit the spinnerbait, but they wanted something more than just a subtle Texas rig, and that's when I'd start throwing a bladed jig, and voila. I mean, it was like, that's what they wanted. And I love it because it's kind of a mix between a crankbait and a spinnerbait and a jig all mixed into one, and it just seems to get bites when other lures aren't working. While it's not as snag proof as a Texas rig, you can still fish it along grass lines, weed lines, and up along brush piles, underneath docks. And similar to a crankbait, it's really effective along rocky stretches. So while I'm fishing a bladed jig, I really have to determine the fish's mood. So sometimes they want it fast. I'm gonna cast it out and start reeling immediately. However, other times they want it slow. So I'm gonna cast it out, I'm gonna let it sink to the bottom, and I might slowly reel it back, or I might drag it back with my rod tip, or I might hop it back. I focus on what's getting the most bites and adjust accordingly. So if casting out and reeling it back is getting more bites and letting it sink to the bottom, that's what I'm gonna be doing with the bladed jig. And since we're on the jig topic, there are several styles of jigs, and honestly, they can get kind of confusing. But my go-to jig while bank fishing is a swim jig. I love a swim jig because despite being designed to swim back to you, you can drag it along the bottom. You can fish it through some pretty weedy areas, into brush piles, skip it underneath docks. It's a very versatile lure, and once again, it's more for the subtle approach. So when that bladed jig and that spinnerbait aren't working, switch to a swim jig. Sometimes you need to rig a soft plastic on the back of it to give it a little bit more oomph and make it look more enticing. Other times you can leave it off and keep that narrower profile, and that's what the fish want. As I said, you can fish it on the bottom, fishing it super slow, or you can fish it up in the water column, fishing it a lot faster. It honestly just depends on the fish's mood for the day. One lure that rarely lets me down is an inline spinner. And it's one that I'm honestly shocked more anglers don't use, they don't talk about, because it catches a ton of fish. It doesn't matter what species it is, it's gonna bite an inline spinner. I've caught bass, I've caught northern pike, bluegill, catfish, crappie, and trout on inline spinners. It's a little more subtle than a spinnerbait. That's why it's a little more attractive to fish, And while it's not great for casting into brush piles or into the grass, fishing it along the edges is spectacular. I also love that you can switch out the treble hooks, which is what I primarily use, for a single hook. So whether that body of water doesn't allow treble hooks or you just keep getting snagged, switch to that single hook and you'll still be able to catch a ton of fish without worrying about getting snagged or breaking the law. Now, I know I said I was gonna give you 5, but I'm just feeling super generous today. And since you've watched this far into the video, I'm gonna leave you with 3 other lures that I've always got ready. The first one is a wacky rig. A wacky rig forces me to slow down and really fish an area, and it's led to a ton of more catches because I was just more patient. And I sat there and I just pestered the fish more and more until they were like, okay, this meal's too easy, I've just gotta eat it. So if you're still struggling to catch fish after running through these 5, a wacky rig is probably the way to go. And another lure that I've just absolutely fallen in love with in recent years are crappie jigs. Yes, in the name they say crappie, and you would think, oh well, they're for crappie and crappie alone. That's not true. Because they look like little bitty minnows, everything eats them. Once again, I've caught pretty much anything you can think of on a crappie jig. Sometimes it's little bitty fish, and sometimes it's really big fish. So don't be afraid to downsize your line, downsize your lures, and start using crappie jigs when the bite is really tough. For me, crappie jigs have really shined in the wintertime. In previous years, I didn't fish very much in the winter because I just didn't think the fish were biting. But when I started using crappie jigs, I found that I've gotten a lot more bites in the cooler months thanks to crappie jigs. But that doesn't mean they don't work in the summertime, because I still use them in the summertime, and of course, during the crappie spawn in the spring. So really, this is an all year round lure, but I've just noticed that it's shined for me in the wintertime. So if you're looking for more of a wintertime lure, crappie jigs might be for you. And lastly, the most overlooked bait of all time is live bait. And that's because the pros don't talk about it. I get it. It's against the rules for pros to use it in tournaments. But as a bank angler, just fun fishing, use live bait. I absolutely slaughter fish with worms and minnows every time I use them. And this is because this is what the fish are actually eating. Number 1, it looks like what they're eating. It smells like what they're eating. It tastes like what they're eating because that's what they're eating. So don't be afraid to use live bait while you're going and fishing. Just like many of these other lures, it catches a wide variety of fish. I've even caught turtles on it, which I'm not a super big fan of because I don't like getting turtles off of the hook, but live bait catches everything from little fish to big fish and a number of species. Now that you know what lures will work best from the bank, it's time to learn where it's best to store them at. And that means you need the best tackle box for your situation. You see, pros need a different tackle box because they are in a boat. And typically, I use the same tackle boxes as I do while kayak fishing. I just take them out of my kayak crate. However, I spent a ton of time testing several different tackle boxes for various situations, and you can find that video right below me to see which one works best for you. I can't wait to see you there.